Sign this paper in the next 30 minutes, or you walk out with nothing. That's what 3 executives told a man who had given the company 22 years of his life. He signed something that day, but it wasn't what they wanted. And 5 days later, their own lawyer called him at dawn, his voice shaking. Let me back up and tell you exactly how we got to that room, because the ending only makes sense once you understand everything that led up to it. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 58 years old, and for 22 years I served as the Senior Director of Supply Chain Operations at Ironclad Systems, a logistics software company headquartered in Denver, Colorado. We built the backbone that let manufacturing giants track shipments across 3 continents without losing a single pallet. I started there in the fall of 2003 as a junior analyst, fresh out of business school, making $61,000 a year and living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment that ate half my paycheck. By the time this story really begins, my salary had grown to $310,000 a year, plus bonuses, stock options, and full benefits I'd earned over 2 decades of showing up and doing the work nobody else wanted to touch. I wasn't just an employee. I was the memory of the company. When the CEO forgot the fine print on a client contract signed a decade earlier, he called me. When finance needed billing records from before half the current staff was hired, they came to my office. I ran a team of 68 people spread across 3 continents, and my division alone brought in over $100 million a year in steady revenue. I knew which vendor had quietly gone under during the recession years and how we'd rebuilt that supply line from scratch. I knew which client contracts had clauses buried on page 40 that nobody else had bothered to read since the day they were signed. That kind of knowledge doesn't show up on an org chart, but it runs a company just as much as anything in the annual report. For 22 years, I was the person nobody could replace. Then, almost overnight, I became the person somebody wanted gone. It started 8 months before that final meeting. In January, Ironclad Systems was bought out by a massive private equity firm called Vantage Capital Partners, valued at nearly $20 billion. Vantage had a reputation. They bought profitable mid-sized tech companies, gutted the experienced staff, and replaced them with young hires who'd accept half the salary and ask no questions. I'd watched this exact playbook wipe out 3 competitors in our industry over the previous 2 years. I knew what was coming, and I knew it would arrive dressed up as good news before it ever showed its real face. The new leadership arrived in late January, wearing tailored suits and promising nothing would change. Our new CEO was Trevor Sinclair, 37 years old, an Ivy League graduate who'd run a startup into the ground after burning through $40 million in funding. He had a polished resume and 0 real experience running an actual operations division. Our new CFO was Nathaniel Cross, 36. A former consultant who could build a beautiful spreadsheet but had never actually managed people. And our new COO was Adrian Voss, 40 years old, who'd spent less than 2 years at Vantage before this promotion and genuinely believed that watching a company fail once made him an expert. They held a company-wide meeting in February. Trevor stood at the podium in the conference room I had personally helped design a decade earlier, down to the paint color on the walls, and delivered the speech I'd heard almost word for word from friends at other acquired companies. "Nothing is going to change," he said. "We value every one of you. Your jobs are secure. We're thrilled to be part of this team." I'd heard that speech before, almost word for word, from a friend at a company Vantage had swallowed up 2 years earlier. He'd told me the exact same promises were made right before he was pushed out with nothing. And I knew from experience that when executives go out of their way to promise that nothing will change, it usually means everything is about to change, starting with the people who've been there the longest. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and updated my resume. But I also did something else. Something my grandfather taught me. He spent 30 years as a union representative at a rail yard in Michigan, standing between exhausted workers and executives who thought they could push people around with a signature. He always said companies count on you having no proof. So I started keeping my own record. Every email, every policy change, every quiet comment in a hallway. I backed it all up on encrypted drives at home, because I'd seen what happens to people who get walked out the door with a cardboard box and nothing to show for decades of work. Once you're locked out of the system, your memory is the only evidence you have left. And I wasn't going to let mine disappear with a single keystroke from someone in IT. The layoffs began in March, a month after the meeting. On a Tuesday morning, they let go of 22 employees in a single hour. Every one of them was over 55. Every one of them made more than $170,000 a year. Within a month, they'd been replaced by 20-somethings, earning less than half as much. HR called it a strategic realignment. I called it exactly what it was, and I kept my mouth shut while I documented every name, every replacement, every meeting wherever age or salary came up as a deciding factor. In April, they started on me. Slowly at first. I was quietly dropped from meetings I'd run for over a decade, including a critical database migration I'd spent 5 years optimizing to prevent downtime for our biggest clients. When I asked Trevor why my invitation had vanished, he told me they wanted fresh perspective on that project. A few weeks later, 4 of my core responsibilities were handed to a 28-year-old named Colton, who'd been with the company 10 months and didn't understand the vendor relationships I'd spent years building. Then came the public humiliation. During a full department meeting, Adrian stood up and openly mocked my emphasis on data security protocols, calling it outdated thinking that was holding the company back. My own team sat there in silence while I was dressed down in front of everyone. It was a calculated move, meant to embarrass me into quitting so they wouldn't owe me a severance package. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I kept showing up every single day, kept doing my job well, and kept writing everything down the moment I got home each night. My personnel file was spotless. 22 years of strong reviews, 0 write-ups, and multiple awards for operational excellence hanging on my office wall. They knew they couldn't fire me for cause without opening themselves up to a lawsuit. And that fact ate at them more than they ever let on. In June, they tried something new. Nathaniel called me into his office late on a Friday afternoon, always a bad sign. He told me they were eliminating my position and creating a new role called Senior Operations Coordinator, which I was welcome to apply for. The new salary was $160,000 a year, less than half what I currently made, for essentially the same responsibilities under a smaller title. It was a demotion dressed up as an opportunity, and it was designed to push me out the door voluntarily. I told him calmly that I needed time to think it over. Then I drove straight home and called Renata Ashcroft, an employment attorney I'd hired back in March when the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Renata had spent over 20 years fighting corporate age discrimination cases, and she'd won the overwhelming majority of them. She listened to everything, asked a dozen sharp questions, and told me flatly, "That offer is constructive dismissal dressed up in nicer language, and you don't sign a single thing. Let them make their next move first," she said, "because desperate people always show their hand eventually." I waited 35 days. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I got the email I knew was coming. Trevor wanted to see me in the main conference room at 3 o'clock. Not his office. A conference room meant witnesses. It meant this was official. It meant they were finally going to fire me. I printed the resignation letter Renata and I had drafted weeks earlier after several careful revisions, folded it, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I walked into that room at exactly 3 o'clock. Trevor, Nathaniel, Adrian, and someone from HR named Marguerite Doyle were already seated on one side of a long table, 4 leather folders and 4 silver pens laid out in front of them like they were about to perform surgery. There was one chair on my side, facing all of them. Trevor thanked me for coming on short notice and launched into corporate language about restructuring and moving in a different direction. I said nothing. Renata had told me that silence is the most powerful thing I could bring into that room. So I let them talk. Nathaniel slid a folder across the table. 2 options, he said. Option 1. I resign voluntarily today and receive 3 weeks of severance, about $18,000, plus my unused vacation pay and a neutral reference. Option 2. They terminate me for restructuring and I get nothing at all. Not even vacation pay, with a note in my file that could follow me into future job searches. That second option wasn't really an option at all. It was a threat dressed up as paperwork, a not-so-subtle message that I should take the small payout quietly, or risk walking away with absolutely nothing after more than 2 decades of loyal work. They were betting I'd be too scared, too tired, or too eager to just move on with my life to fight back. I opened the folder. Inside was a pre-written resignation letter on company letterhead, just waiting for my signature, releasing the company from any future legal claims in exchange for a fraction of what I was actually owed. It was a trap, plain and simple. I looked at the 4 of them, young, confident, certain they had me cornered. Trevor kept checking his watch like he had dinner plans. Nathaniel had a small smirk on his face. Adrian leaned back like the meeting was already over. I thought about my grandfather standing on that rail yard floor, telling me never to sign anything without reading it 3 times, and never to let a person in an expensive suit make me feel small, just because he had a fancier title. A title doesn't make a man honest, he used to tell me, and a cheap suit can still hide a thief. You have rights. Know them cold. And when the moment comes, use every single one of them without apologizing for it. I'll resign, I said. Relief washed over their faces immediately. But I'll write my own letter, I added. The room went quiet. Trevor stammered something about the letter already covering the legal requirements. I told him I'd write my own, and if he had a problem with that, he could explain to a judge why he wouldn't let an employee choose his own words. He backed down and told me to have it to them by 5 o'clock. I walked out of that room, locked my office door, and opened my laptop. Renata and I had written this letter weeks earlier, 1 sentence, carefully built, word by word. I sent her a message telling her the moment had come. She replied instantly, "Send it exactly as written." I printed it, signed it in blue ink, made 3 copies, and walked back into that conference room at 4:30. I handed it to Trevor. He skimmed it, nodded, and said HR would process everything. I asked for the severance breakdown in writing. Nathaniel rattled off the number, $18,000 plus my accrued vacation. I confirmed the vacation total, confirmed my outstanding expense reimbursements, and walked out for the last time. I drove home in the evening light, poured myself a glass of wine, sat on my back porch and waited, knowing full well that the quiet wouldn't last. 5 days later, on a Tuesday morning at 7:15, my phone rang. It was Gordon Blackwell, General Counsel for Vantage Capital Partners. His voice was tight. He said there was some confusion about language in my resignation letter. Specifically, the part stating my resignation would only take effect once I received full settlement of everything legally owed to me. I explained it plainly. My resignation wasn't effective yet. Until the company paid me everything owed under my contract and under Colorado law, I remained a fully active employee with every right that came with that status. There was a long silence on the line. The kind of silence that tells you someone on the other end has just realized they made a very expensive mistake. He asked what exactly I believed they owed me. I walked him through it. My base salary through the actual resignation date. My accrued vacation, which came to just over $30,000. Outstanding expense reimbursements. My annual performance bonus worth $240,000. Then came the stock options. Under the change of control clause buried in my quarter-century-old employment contract, all of my vested and unvested options accelerated immediately upon acquisition if my role was constructively eliminated. That alone came to just under $2.5 million based on current valuation. And finally, the severance clause I'd negotiated 15 years earlier when I first moved into a director role. 2 full years of base salary plus 2 years of health insurance premiums if I was ever pushed out without cause. That added another $680,000 plus $50,000 in insurance costs. Altogether, it came to just over $3.5 million. Gordon's voice cracked slightly as he said this was outrageous, that no court would ever uphold a resignation letter written like that, and that they'd fight it all the way if they had to. I reminded him that I had 22 years of documentation showing a pattern of age discrimination across the entire organization, starting with the March layoffs. I told him Colorado law treats willful withholding of owed wages as a serious offense, with real damages attached. He could pay what was owed, or we could let a judge decide whether HR had knowingly accepted a conditional resignation without objection, which they had, in writing. He hung up. He called back that evening with an offer of $1.8 million. I told him that number wasn't close to what was legally owed. He came back an hour later with a final offer that matched what I'd calculated, plus attorney fees. I had 20 business days to receive the wire. 18 days later, the full settlement landed in my account. $3.6 million, exactly as promised, wired in full with no further arguments from anyone at Vantage Capital Partners. I sat at that same kitchen table where I'd first started updating my resume all those months earlier. And I read the confirmation email 3 times just to make sure it was real. It was. 22 years. And in the end, they learned the hard way that the quietest man in the room is often the one who's been paying the closest attention the entire time. They saw an aging director they could push around with a folder and 2 silver pens. What they actually had in front of them was a man who'd spent 2 decades quietly learning exactly how the machine worked and exactly what it owed him the moment it tried to spit him out. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger, and it isn't a scene in a conference room either. It's simply standing your ground, staying calm when everyone expects you to fold, and collecting every single dollar you were always rightfully owed. If this story hit home for you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to Aftermath Tales for more stories like this one every week.